Welcome to another episode of the Ivan Herrera Show. In this video, we are focusing exclusively on players that you need to take a very close eye on in week 3. And also, I'm going to go over some must-sell highs and some buy lows that you can leverage to really position your fantasy football rosters for success. And let's go ahead and get started. The first player that we're going to be focusing on is going to be Carson Steele out of the Kansas City Chiefs. It's no mystery that as soon as the news broke out that Isaiah Pacheco was going to miss some time with the injury that he suffered, that Carson Steele was going to be someone that was going to be heavily coveted when it came to waivers. And before hitting waivers, he was only rostered in 4% of rosters. Now, fast forward, we are getting ready for the weekend, and not only is he going to fill in for Isaiah Pacheco, but he is going to fill in a slot where Pacheco was 6th in opportunity share and he was 7th in snap share among the running backs in the league. Now, the volume, of course, will make it intriguing, but so will the matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons allow the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, and there is a really interesting piece that I found from Dwayne McFarland's utilization report, and he shares that the team has fed rookie Carson Steele the most relief carries at 20%, as well as the short down distance snaps. So if you're concerned on whether or not Samaje Perine could possibly take some of this role, I believe that Carson Steele early on right now is the one that you want to have on your roster. Of course, it'll be very interesting to see how they deploy Samaje Perine and of course Kareem Hunt as well in that Kansas City offense. Now, a second running back, this is more of a dart throw, is going to be Cam Akers from the Houston Texans. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning him is because earlier on when I was doing my research on this subject, we were still wondering if Dameon Pierce was going to play, what is the status of the Joe Mixon injury, and the thing is, we now know that Dameon Pierce was downgraded to out, so Akers is going to have some kind of role in this matchup. And Joe Mixon suffered last week a high ankle sprain, and he looks to still potentially play. However, one thing to take notice of is that in week 1, Joe Mixon had 57 snaps. We saw that number go down to 29 in week 2 because of him nursing that injury that he suffered in week 2's matchup. Now, the one thing that is intriguing though is that despite Cam Akers getting some usage in week 2, he did only have 7 carries and also happened to have a goal line fumble. And the matchup isn't necessarily very intriguing going up against the Minnesota Vikings, who they're actually among a top 10 offense, they are among the top 10 in ranked defenses against the opposing running back position when it comes to fantasy points allowed to that position itself. So Cam Akers for me is more of a dart throw, but definitely worth monitoring, especially if you are in a pinch, considering that there are a lot of serious injuries out there in fantasy. One thing I want to pivot to is that we know that earlier in the week we had heard the news that Bryce Young was going to be benched, and with that, enter in quarterback Andy Dalton for the Carolina Panthers, the veteran quarterback that was signed to be a backup to Bryce Young. And we don't know too much of what this offense will look like because of course they now have a new offensive coordinator. There's a few new weapons that were implemented that weren't there last year. And the thing is, last season, we actually got to see Andy Dalton play for the Panthers. And in that game, which so happened to also be week 3 in 2023, he started to fill in for Bryce Young, who was hurt. The performance that Andy Dalton had that season was actually the second best offensive performance that the Carolina Panthers had the entire year. And Andy Dalton in that game threw for over 300 yards. And with that, the next player that you need to keep your eyes out for is going to be Diontae Johnson, because I think he's going to benefit maybe slightly. I don't know how he will do season long, but it's clear that Andy Dalton's going to be an upgrade over Bryce Young. And with Diontae already playing 94% of the snaps in week 2, we already know that he is someone that is going to handle all those targets, is going to be heavily involved in this offense. I expect Diontae to have a bounce back game from a slow start to his season, and someone that you should definitely keep an eye out for, especially if he ends up having a good performance in week 3. So for those of you that have been following the channel as well as the podcast for some time, especially during the off season, you are well aware that I was huge on Zamir White. And of course, the first 2 weeks really haven't been anything worth hanging my hat on as far as that call. And in week 1, he underperformed. And despite having a lower amount of rushes in week 2, he did see an uptick in snap percentage. In week 1, he had his snap percentage be at 38%. In week 2, we saw that number go up to 63%. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is because we saw Madison have a very similar numbers, which in the first 2 weeks, but we saw that those numbers go down for Madison in week 2. And the matchup is what's very intriguing for me, because the Las Vegas Raiders are going up against the Arizona Cardinals. And the Arizona Cardinals actually allow the second most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And to take it a step further, Antonio Pierce had a very interesting quote earlier this week, and he had shared about how I'm going to keep pumping him up, him as in Zamir White. Our goal is to get 20 plus touches with him. So that volume alone, 20 plus touches from the running back position, is a phenomenal number, and that for me at least locks him in as a must start. And of course, it's hard to think of so many different better options considering that there's so many injuries that we're all dealing with. And for me, Zamir White is someone that not only because of the volume, but you also couple that with the matchup that he has, he'll be someone that is going to be very intriguing and someone worth keeping on your radar to see how he performs. Now we're going to go ahead and transition over to the buy low and the sell high candidates that I have thus far. And it's no surprise that for me, I am extremely happy that the J.K. Dobbins call that I made earlier in the offseason is really panning out. So far through 2 weeks, he has been the RB4 on a points per game basis. He's had 2 straight games in PPR formats where he has scored over 20 fantasy points. And he's also had 2 straight games where he's rushed over 130 yards. And the reason why I actually currently have him as a sell high is because what worries me is the snap percentage that he's currently having compared to that of his teammate Gus Edwards. Now, from the first 2 games, the snap percentages that we have seen Gus Edwards have been 42% in week 1, 48% in week 2. Now, if we were to analyze that for J.K. Dobbins, that number was 58% in week 1 and went down to 46%. So how do you now, I guess, speak to those percentages? Well, what gives me solace if you're a J.K. Dobbs owner is that Greg Roman, their offensive coordinator for the Chargers, did say earlier in the month that they will deploy the hot hand. So currently, with the efficiency that Gus Edwards has had, he has been the best option for the Chargers. But what does worry me is as I'm looking down the road to the next few matchups that he's going to be having, and he's going to be facing some pretty stingy defenses, beginning with Pittsburgh and Kansas City, who are both among the top 5 in defenses that allow the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. So if you can potentially get J.K. Dobbins for maybe an upgrade at wide receiver, maybe even try to swindle a package where you can combine J.K. Dobbins with maybe Rashid Shaheed for maybe an A.J. Brown who's hurt, and maybe the owner that has A.J. Brown is 0-2. See if you can maybe use A.J. Brown as a stash, but utilize those pieces there to help you get that player. So for me, J.K. Dobbins, because of the fact that he's going to have some stingy defenses, I would much rather move on and get an upgrade somewhere else, being that I don't know if the success that he's had thus far can be sustainable. Now, another player that I'm going to be actually buying low on now is going to be Amari Cooper. And Amari Cooper has had an ugly start. I mean, I can't convince you that it's been pretty. What we do like is that he's had 17 targets, and he's had a 26% target share, but he's only had 5 receptions. And he's had 2 drop touchdowns. But what does give me some solace is that, of course, we know that he is the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense, so he's going to continue to get those looks. And I believe that with the matchups that he has coming up, he is going to be put in a position to be successful. Now, the next 2 weeks, he's going to be facing middle-of-the-pack secondaries with the New York Giants and the Las Vegas Raiders. And 2 weeks after that, he's going to be facing the Washington Commanders and my beloved Philadelphia Eagles, who both happen to be the 2 worst defenses in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So if you have Amari Cooper, I'd say continue rolling him out there because the matchups are going to get better. He's had the opportunities. He's going to continue to get those targets. And for me, he at least becomes a flex lock, maybe even a wide receiver 2 option for you. But I do expect the tide to turn in a positive way for Amari Cooper. So he's a buy low. And another buy low that I think you should look into is going to be Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk has had a very slow start, and I feel really bad because this is someone that I was really high on. And the argument that I made then was that we knew that Christian Kirk has had familiarity with Trevor Lawrence, just like Evan Ingram. But unfortunately, he's not getting the first two. I mean, he's not. I mean, through the first 2 weeks, he's been absolutely dreadful. But what does give me some peace is that since joining the Jacksonville Jaguars, his target share on an average basis has been over 20%. In 2022, he was at a 23.2% target share. Last season at a 20.8%, and that's with them even including Calvin Ridley and seeing the emergence of Travis Etienne in the passing game. However, we are seeing that the matchup is going to be pretty intriguing for the Jacksonville Jaguars because Christian Kirk is going to be lining up out of the slot, and the Buffalo Bills are going to be without their slot cornerback, Diontae Johnson. And I believe that with that opportunity that Kirk is going to have, he should be able to capitalize and be still a must start for you, and also a buy low candidate. And the reason why I'm going to go even further is because Evan Ingram, unfortunately, is going to be potentially out for a second straight week, which means Kirk is going to continue to get that target share and hopefully be able to fill in that gap for the absence of Evan Ingram. And I know that we've been seeing Brian Thomas Jr. do some things, but I believe that the overall chemistry that he has, as well as the history of him having a solid target share within this offense, will make him a solid buy low candidate for you this season. Now, to put a bow on this one, we have one more player that I'm going to be going over, and that's going to be Brandon Aiyuk. Now, Brandon Aiyuk, who has been someone that was drafted extremely high in the offseason, he was going like second, third round, and he's been rough. Man, I mean, the first 2 weeks have been terrible. I mean, he went, 4 for 43? He's been the wide receiver 60 or something like that. I mean, absolutely terrible. But what does give you peace, and I think that's the trend, is you got to look a little bit deeper into the numbers. You can't just look at the box score as far as receptions and targets and think that's as far as the data will take you. But he has run routes on 90% of the snaps, and we're also seeing a plethora of injuries take place with not only Christian McCaffrey, but we're now hearing Deebo Samuel and potentially even now George Kittle, which means who is Brock Purdy going to throw to? That's going to be Brandon Aiyuk. And I have this stat I wanted to share with you from my friends at RotoViz. In 48 games with Deebo Samuel in the lineup, Aiyuk has been solid, averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game. Now, in 16 games without Deebo Samuel in the lineup, where he's been the number one guy, he's averaged 15.47 points a game. So we can say 15.5 points. And in those games, he's had a average targets per game of set to 8 compared to 5.7 when Deebo was in the lineup. So with so many injuries, with a lack of depth there for the San Francisco 49ers, Brandon Aiyuk becomes a very intriguing buy low option. And I would strongly urge you to do that now before we start seeing him blow up, considering that they will be playing the Rams. And if you didn't know this, the Rams play single high, which Brandon Aiyuk tends to shred that kind of scheme when it comes to defenses trying to line up against this 49ers team. Hey, you made it to the very end of the video. Thank you so much. It means the absolute world that you would tune in this far into the video. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe, and be sure to check out some of these other videos that will help you dominate your fantasy football rosters. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.